welcome. You're watching Boardroom Brunch here on News9 Live. I am Krishnakumar, and joining us on this edition of Boardroom Brunch is Mr. Parag Naik, CEO of Saankhya Labs, India's first fabless semiconductor manufacturing company. Parag, great to have you with us here on the show. We're going to talk about semiconductors, not the easiest of things that people understand or enjoy talking about, but it's clearly very, very important. Everything from our mobile phones to the cars. India wants to become a global semiconductor making hub, and it announced its ambitions with the launch of the semiconductor mission in 2020 at the peak of the pandemic, when the pinch of the lack of semiconductors hit the delivery of cars of Indians. It's been 3 years since India launched that semiconductor mission, and you as a company have been making semiconductors for a decade and a half in this country. Tell us, what does this semiconductor mission mean for an Indian company like you, and how far it's progressed in the last 3 years?
Thank you, Krishna, for having me here. And like you rightly said, during COVID, people realized that to run all your cool apps and sell stuff on internet, you also need underneath hardware, right? So that's the reason, and people realized, okay, you also need chips to run that. And then suddenly people have become aware of the entire ecosystem, including all the geopolitics around it and surrounding it. This semiconductor mission in India was long overdue, right? We've been talking about it for decades. We had the Chandigarh fab, but then we fell behind. So this is long overdue. It's actually a good thing that's happened. We are not a manufacturing company, we are a design company, because building in semiconductors ecosystem, you got two major classes of companies, right? One is the fabless semiconductor company, which we are one. We are the first in India. And then you have the manufacturing companies, where you actually get the thing manufactured and then send it back to companies like us, and we sell. A large bunch of companies around the world. This fabless model was kind of has evolved over the last 20 years. Companies like Qualcomm and NVIDIA, probably everybody knows about them right now. They don't own a fab, right? So these fabless companies are also largely successful. We are one of them. Coming back to the success of the PLI scheme or the announcement of this scheme, I think it's too early to measure that, right? These are long cycles. Countries and companies take 20-25 years before actually things happen. I mean, people hear about TSMC, interestingly, now, right? TSMC started in 1986 until 2001, 2002. They were just one of the other companies that went around. And but in this short span, I think it's been largely successful, largely because there's a lot of corporate India now who's interested in semiconductors, right? I think there have been announcements that Tata Group, which we are part of, we got acquired. The Murugappa Group is announced something, L&T has announced something. So this augurs well for India, because we always had the talent, we didn't have the leadership, and we didn't have the business backing to actually build semiconductors. And the last point is, there's no such thing as completely indigenous ecosystem. This ecosystem is very complex, and supply chain is very different from the rest of the world, right? In the sense that you aim to be part of the global supply chain. You can't just displace all of it, because the technology comes from all over the world, from Europe, from Japan, from the US, and hopefully in 10 years from now, large parts of it will come from India.
Okay, 10 years from now is the kind of horizon that you're looking at. But this entire Indian semiconductor mission has also excited global semiconductor companies which are doubling down on investments in India, from Micron to Applied Materials. Prime Minister Modi on his US visit also ended up inking an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with US President Joe Biden and the US government for the development of semiconductor technologies. So this essentially opens up India for global semiconductor companies to come in and invest and make and design. And at the same time, the Indian semiconductor mission also makes it clear it's not only meant for domestic demand of semiconductor chips, which means that whatever gets made in India, designed and manufactured in India, is meant for exports globally as well. How does this play out for an Indian semiconductor designer who's been in the country for so long?
Actually, like I said, there are two parts, right? There's a fabless part and there's a semiconductor manufacturing part. Okay. On the fabless design part, we have a fairly vibrant ecosystem in India. All it lacked was a bit of a leadership. Practically every company, any semiconductor company worth its salt has a presence in Bangalore. Yeah. So there's a critical mass of engineers who understand the entire flow. But we practically have no play in the manufacturing side, right? We have had no play so far. So it needed some kickstart, some push. So in that sense, even getting some of those skills in will help us a long way in actually building out a manufacturing ecosystem. The manufacturing ecosystem is far more complex than the design ecosystem, which needs stuff like chemicals. It needs you need to have lasers. You need to have a whole lot of other complex stuff that that you can't break down in a small interview such as this. Getting those skills, building the process engineers, building all that will take time, and getting the globals in that sense is a good first step because they have the experience and they've been doing it for 25 to 30 years.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. So under the semiconductor mission, the PLI schemes were launched. There were incentives meant to encourage Indian semiconductor makers. In your view, what has been the success rate so far? Because the question here is how tepid has it been in the beginning?
Like I said, right, this is too short a time frame to measure the success of it. But the interest that it has generated, I think that you should measure it on that. On that scale, I think it's been reasonably, and if not reasonably, quite successful at that. Like I said, the first step to actually building something is talking about it, right? And having all the corporates in India and internationally come and make public announcements on this is actually a good sign. What was happening, unfortunately, in the last 10 years is that everybody was trying to build up an app or a taxi fleet. All the smart guys were off on building taxi fleets, right? There are no incentives to do something hard and difficult as semiconductors. Now that signaling is happening to to this generation, saying that this is an interesting space. Just as pure software or application development is an interesting space, this is an interesting space. In that sense, it has been quite successful. There have been a lot of a lot of things around building talent for the global talent pool for the world. In that sense, also it's been successful. But the manufacturing thing, you got to measure it, at least in a 5-year scale, a minimum 5 to 7 year scale. I don't think we can, we can measure it that way. I mean, in some sense, at least Micron has started some groundbreaking in Gujarat on the fab or the OSAT facility. Tata is doing some stuff. Murugappa is doing stuff. In that sense, it's been fairly successful.
All right. The question is being asked about a tepid response to the PLI scheme or the tepid progress of the PLI scheme because it's 11,000 crore rupee disbursement target. Much less of it has been done so far. What do you think is the reason why, when the target is so nice and juicy, so much less has been applied of it so far?
It's a complex thing, right? And building a fab takes a lot of time, a lot of money. And there are very few people who understand it, right? And also, so that does takes a fairly long amount of time. And in that sense, like I said earlier, the interest that's come in is indicative of it. And also, I always view this. I mean, we have been working at this for 14 years, and we've been saying this from rooftops for the last 10 years. And people thought we were madmen, right? Trying to sell semiconductors when everybody was selling stuff on internet and becoming unicorns and becoming billionaires. So these things take time. Yeah. And we've seen that with ourselves, right? It's like the Chinese wrong analogy, but the Chinese bamboo tree. It develops underneath, and when it comes up, it grows, in 3 months. So we need to give it that time.
Okay, we need to give it that time. Also, the disbursement, specific, like white goods companies' disbursement has been low. Manufacturing companies' disbursement has been low. Thousands of crore rupees allocated in different of these sectors. What do you think is the reason for the hold up in say, disbursement to white goods companies, which are already prevalent, so many of them existent so far, and manufacturing companies?
I think it's picking up. You would see that at least on the white goods and on one order of lesser complexity, which is the electronic manufacturing companies, you see a lot of them listed today on the stock markets and see them doing very well. That's the sign of the sign of times to come, right? It is, I think, it is an inflection point, right? I think in the next 6 months to a year, you'll see a lot of them actually do take off. And like I said, even something as less complex as electronic manufacturing is a complex process, and we've done that. We've seen that it takes time to build talent and build the skill in India to ramp up the, and on top of it to make money on it, right? So it's a difficult business, difficult proposition. Yeah.
Okay. Now tell us what are the opportunities and the threats going forward for India and its ambitions to become this global semiconductor hub? Because for the longest time, there was no clear government support. Now, that clear government intention, support, and money, hard cash, is there on the table. So, at this stage, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities?
I'll look at the opportunities first. I think, all these things, factories, mines, I mean, you can give all these, incentives and all of that. At the end of the day, it is human capital and human talent that's important. And people respond to incentives. So far, the private capital had incentivized internet-facing, consumer-facing companies, so they thrived, right? If you see, the initial investment in those companies happened in the decade of 2005 to 2010, when riding on the back of 3G and 4G deployments. But they really took off in 14 and 15. So in that sense, we have from just an if you take the software services view of the world, you have the ability to actually provide human talent and capital to the rest of the world. But as we do that, we also would get madmen like us once in a while, it's not often enough yet, who actually would go and aspire to build some of these things in India. And more of these things, more of these people get into it, the chances of the likelihood of a success and a big success is higher. So in that sense, like I said, people respond to incentives, and the right incentives are being set to build semiconductor industry in India. The challenges, of course, it's the David versus Goliath battles, right? Not every time a David wins, but nevertheless, you have all these mature $1 trillion or $500 billion companies whom you compete with. But then that's where the creativity comes in, right? How do we localize stuff for India? How do we create unique stuff, which differentiates us? And we have done that for 14 years. To survive in this kind of a environment, when in fact there is a global winter on funding on semiconductor companies. We are one of the few companies, and Intel Capital, by the way, was our investor. General Motors was our investor. So those companies that funded us during the winter time. So I'm sure there are more people come in. It would go up, and threats and opportunities go together hand in hand, right? So I always believe that.
Okay, the one obvious opportunity that I can look at over here is India making for the world. Yeah. And tell us about that opportunity and the kind of clients that you yourself service globally, and the opportunities that exist. And talk to us about India's own fledgling semiconductor ecosystem, which is already making for the world.
Absolutely. So we are building the entire telecom stack in India, right, for BSNL. That's being done right now. So we are talking to a lot of international customers. By the way, we are always international first. We have sold. We are one of the few companies that has sold technology to China, to Korea, to Europe, and to the US. So our customers have been international, but we over a period of time we also have had success inside of India. So for example, ISRO is a big customer of ours, right? For all the satellite technologies, we build modems and stuff like that. So if you my own belief is if you stay long enough, even a dud actually can become a smart guy at the end of 14 years. I think the 14 years, I think, is in our Indic mythology, 14 years is a very good thing, right? 14 years is the time that Ram spent in Vanvas. 14 years is the time Buddha actually, I'm not sure, 14 years is the time he spent meditating. Once you spend 14 years, you become experts in that field.
Right, fascinating. Joining us on this edition of Boardroom Brunch is Mr. Shashi Shekhar Vempati, former CEO of Prasar Bharati. Mr. Vempati, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to begin by asking a very simple question. India has a very clearly stated ambition to become a global semiconductor hub, and it announced that ambition with the launch of the India Semiconductor Mission. Prime Minister Modi launching it at the peak of the pandemic when semiconductor shortage was all the talk of the town. It's been 3 years since then. Talk to us from your perspective. How has the launch of the Semiconductor Mission and its progress been so far?
See, if you look at, you rightly pointed out that the entire narrative around semiconductor mission and India's strategy started around COVID. Clearly, COVID brought out the geopolitical risks in the supply chain for semiconductors, the entire dependence that the world had on a certain part of the region from where most of this technology was being sourced from. And it was very important that India builds its own capabilities in this space. In fact, often when you read Nandan or any of the guys who talk about DPIs and what is happening with digital technologies. The oft-used phrase is data is the new oil. But what about the oil fields, right? Because that is where all the hardware is, and who owns that? And we have hardly any domestic capacity or technology around it. It is only now that fabless design firms in India are emerging. We have started attracting global manufacturing companies to set up base in India. You have a lot of assembling that's happening now. iPhone assembling. Most of the new iPhones are going to be made in India. And I think recently the government also signed up this big project around packaging and testing of semiconductor chips. But we still haven't scratched the surface here, because ultimately the ambition would be that not only would you be designing chips in India, but you would be fabricating and having those silicon foundries in India, where the next generation of chips will be made. And that is not an easy ambition to achieve, and I think that is where the challenge is. So if you ask me what is the progress, I think we are learning along the way to figure out where is that sweet spot, what is that right combination of the kind of chips that India can potentially make, source the technology at a reasonable cost, bring in the right partners who have that experience, because this is not something that everyone in the world can do. It's a very, very specialized domain, and figure out a chip that has reasonable global demand to justify the investment that have to be made in India.
All right. So you're talking about this particular semiconductor mission. At the same time, we need to talk about the PLI incentive schemes that have been put out. Huge 11,000 crore rupees that have been earmarked to set up the foundations of this global semiconductor hub right here in India. But questions over how tepid the PLI scheme has been so far. Disbursements have been low so far. What do you think is the holdup?
Well, I think it's a big bet, right? If you look at any of these silicon fabs, they are big investment bets. They range in the several billions of dollars. So we have to get it right. We can't afford to get it wrong. So, for example, I think one of the contenders for a project of this nature did not have the right technology partner, and hence their whole proposal fell apart, right? So it has to be a very credible proposal. And I think that is the challenge. And as I said, the silicon capacity, the fab capacity has to be such that there is substantial demand worldwide, right? So you can't, because you can't have these idle, because you put in so much capital, you got to produce at a certain rate. And so there has to be adequate demand for that particular nanometer, whether it is 28 nanometers or 46, whatever be the specific technical spec for that. Right, so you have to find that sweet spot, and I think that is where the challenge is, and I'm sure we'll figure that out. We'll probably start with older, more stable chip designs, where maybe the global foundries are not that much interested. Maybe there's an opportunity there for India to get started, and then work our way to more sophisticated. But then remember, we are going to be one of the world's largest markets for mobile devices. So ultimately, I think the ambition would be that the latest chips get designed and made here, but it won't be easy, and we have to build a lot of capacity, a lot of expertise, because that expertise today resides with few, barely a handful of companies worldwide, be it TSMC, be it the Samsung and so on, right? So it's not easy to build that kind of expertise.
All right. As India got forward with this semiconductor mission, you witnessed India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi on his US visit signing a memorandum of understanding with the US government, with President Joe Biden of the US for the making of semiconductors and semiconductor related technologies. At the same time, you also witnessed companies, global semiconductor giants from Micron to Applied Materials, doubling down on their investments here in India. These are extremely good signs, but do you think that the arrival of all this foreign capital and foreign interest will help develop India's indigenous semiconductor industry?
Very interesting question. I think the answer to that would be in finding use cases which are very uniquely Indian. I think yesterday, if you see, Mr. Nilekani also spoke about AI at the Global Tech Summit, where he raised the same issue. It's not about who has the biggest or whatever. It's about the right use cases. Take the case of direct-to-mobile broadcasting. It's a very uniquely technology that's very uniquely suited for India. So you could have the fabless chip design in India, you could have the fabrication in India, and ultimately the consumption. So there's large enough market, right? So you'll have to look for such sweet spots where you can nurture the entire value chain starting from design all the way to the end product. Right, and generate substantial demand, leveraging the size of the Indian market to justify those investments. So we'll have to work our way through those kinds of use cases and scenarios.
Right, and also it also means that you need so much of talent to staff these semiconductor companies that are coming up. Do you think that there's enough and more talent, being fed into this industry as it's looking to develop?
Well, I think many of the engineering schools have started, very focused programs around chip design and so on. So I think that's clearly an area where we should potentially have the kind of talent pool. But I think more than talent, it is the experience, right? Because semiconductor manufacturing is such a specialized domain, and there are so many stages with such sophisticated equipment and technology going into it. And that is not know-how that you can very easily acquire, and you'll have to work your way through that.
All right, so which means that a lot of this talent which went out of India needs to come back as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think if there is one clarion call that the Prime Minister perhaps can make is for that tech talent, to just pause their personal ambitions for a while, come back and do some good for the country. Come on a sabbatical, just give the country those 2-3 years so that we can get this going off the ground, because you need that specialized talent.
All right. The only other question I have to ask you is that there are about 14 sectors that are covered as far as semiconductor manufacturing is concerned when it comes to the PLI, the incentives being doled out. Do you think that is enough, or do you think it has to be expanded to more sectors?
I would think right now, perhaps we have more on the table than takers. So let's maybe figure that out before you go to other domains. I'm sure we'll get to that point very quickly, because once this starts rolling, I'm sure other sectors will get added.
And from your own view, how do you see the development of Indian companies? There have been semiconductor making companies in this country for a decade and a half even, but they've all suddenly come into the spotlight with the launch of the Indian semiconductor mission. One is, of course, Indian companies involved in making semiconductors, and the other is the fact that corporate India as a whole waking up to the importance of semiconductors, irrespective of which sector they belong to.
Right, because if you look at it, historically we've had a lot of services companies, tech services companies, which are always providing services to the VLSI design, be it Sasken. Now you have indigenous fabless chip design companies like Saankhya Labs, and there are several new startups. I just learned of a startup in IIT Delhi, which is looking to develop an AI chip, very uniquely suited for the Indian conditions and Indian market. So I think the potential is limitless, and Indian companies, the larger ones, have to get out of that services mindset. It's not about just providing your talent to a global IP company. Let us build IP in India. I think that is very important, and they should perhaps set aside some money, bet on some of these smaller startups, create IP in India, so that we can then chart the destiny of where this industry is headed in the future.
Right. You've already seen some response. You've seen the Tata Group, L&T, and even Murugappa Group from Chennai, involved in investing into semiconductors.
Right. So my hope is that all of that investment just doesn't go into third-party services. Build some IP, build a patent library, create intellectual property in India.
Create intellectual property in India. It applies not just for semiconductor chips, but for across the board. Also about this essentially comes from the entire idea and the mission set out by Prime Minister Modi to become Atmanirbhar. We want to be Atmanirbhar from everything from defense to as big as defense to as small in terms of size as semiconductor chips.
We have to, because otherwise what is happening is all the global standards are being set by players outside India, who have very little understanding of the very unique needs and demands of India. I think it is time that some of this these global benchmarks are based on the Indian learnings and the Indian experience.
But as you're talking about, as far as the global supply chain for semiconductors is concerned, you have Taiwan, which is a dominant player. Taiwan has geopolitical threats, perennial geopolitical threats from China, and India is pro-Taiwan. India-Taiwan relationship is not the problem. But going forward, when you're seeing so much of manufacturing move out of China because of various geopolitical factors, how do you see the geopolitical landscape, the threats and the opportunities that it provides for India's ambitions to become a global semiconductor hub, or at least form a significant part of this global supply chain?
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge, right? Because deepening a relationship with Taiwan will obviously have its blowback with China. But we have to figure that out, and we have no choice, because we cannot bet our future on these geopolitical risks, right? Now, the interesting thing is TSMC, and they're, across the world, they're building capacity, right? They're building new fabs in the US, Europe, Japan. So we'll have to find the sweet spot that will interest them in India, and I think that is the challenge that we'll have to figure out. But we have no choice but to do this.
All right, and with that, we'll have to let you go. I'm afraid we've completely run out of time here in this edition of Boardroom Brunch. Shashi, thank you so much for taking time out to be with us here. And with that, it's a wrap here from my side. Thank you so much for watching. This is Krishnakumar signing off.